Thanks, Doc. Good morning, everybody. That wasn't too welcoming. Morning, everybody. Yeah, there, much better. So Microsoft and open source, huh? How many people think of open source when you hear the word Microsoft? Huh? Well, hopefully we're going to change that this morning. So why Microsoft and open source? And actually, Microsoft and open source is a journey that we've been on for some time. A journey that was highlighted in the fall. How many people saw this picture or heard of this picture? So a few of you, not all of you. Now, what was really surprising to me about this picture, I was there, and what really surprised me here is that Satya was not wearing a hoodie. And normally he always wears hoodies. And so that was really kind of shocking to me. It would have been really cool, though, if he'd ripped off that shirt and showed you this one right here, which is the one I'm wearing. So the fact is, Microsoft's come a long way from the days of Microsoft doesn't like Linux to Microsoft loves Linux with the CEO on stage talking about it. And like I said, this journey's been going on for a long time. You can see that our interactions with open source date back into the early 2000s in various ways. Of course, it's accelerated over time, but there's some surprising landmark events on this. So you can see back in 2005, we open sourced Bill Gates, it turns out. I didn't know that, but I saw this slide. And so I think there's several distros of him running around, one that's curing malaria, another one that's helping Microsoft with their strategy. So it's really paid off for us, open sourcing Bill. But I'm going to talk this morning about the different ways that we interact with it. And I'm coming as the CTO of Microsoft's cloud platform, Azure, as Todd introduced me. And Azure's really played, I think, a key part in Microsoft's evolution towards embracing open source and leveraging open source and contributing to open source. And as part of my role as CTO, I believe that I've contributed in some ways to that. And so that's why I'm here talking to you this morning. So the fundamental question, though, is why Microsoft and open source? And it turns out that there's many answers to that question because we interact at Microsoft with open source in in different ways. And this is common to probably all the companies that you represent or all the ways that you might interact with open source as well. And they span enabling open source, so enabling the use of open source with our technologies, integrating open source into our technologies, releasing our technologies as open source, and then also contributing to open source projects that are being sponsored by somebody else or part of the open community. And I'm going to talk about how we do that for each one of these categories with some examples of the ways we do that, and then I'll also talk about why we do it. So let's talk about enabling first and what that means. And here's an example of all the different open source projects and companies that we enable with our technologies. You can see there's everything from Puppet to SUSE to Oracle. In fact, as I took a look at this wall of logos, I saw that there's penguins, there's geckos, there's whales, there's warthogs, there's even pizza boxes and flasks. So this is really like a Noah's Ark for nerds, is the way that I look at this kind of logo wall. So some of the examples of the way that we enable open source technologies with our products. They start with Linux and BSD, going back probably close to a decade of supporting those operating systems with our Hyper-V product, our virtualization platform. But one of the seminal points in Microsoft's journey with open source was actually enabling Linux on Microsoft Azure. So back in 2013, Microsoft Azure started as a platform as a service offering, Windows only. But we decided we needed to enable infrastructure as a service so customers could bring their existing applications onto the platform. Our decision at that point wasn't just to support Windows coming out of the box, but we realized that if we really wanted to be a viable cloud platform where customers could come and use the technologies they wanted to use, and turns out that even many predominantly Windows shops have some Linux, that we needed to support Linux as a first-class citizen. So the day that we launched the preview offering of infrastructure as a service publicly, we went out at the same time with both Windows and Linux. And that really started this new principle at Microsoft of Linux and open source as a first-class citizen in Microsoft's ecosystem. You can see other examples here like PHP, Python, Node.js. We want developers to access Microsoft Cloud offerings and services using the tools and technologies that they are comfortable with, and many of those are open source technologies like these. So all of these are supported in our web apps technologies. All of them are supported in our client SDKs. And you can see here's a new one from yesterday. Support for Golang in our web app service is just the latest offering in this category. Our Hadoop offering is called HD Insight, and that's an example of us enabling customers to bring their Hadoop applications onto the platform. And recently, in the last 6 to 9 months, we've introduced support for Spark and Storm as well, since many customers are using Spark and Storm into our HD Insight offering. You can see Puppet and Chef. We worked with both of those companies to make sure that customers could launch virtual machines in Azure that have pre-installed Puppet and Chef agents where they could easily configure them so that those machines could be managed by those solutions. And then a big recent announcement just a few weeks ago at our AzureCon conference with Mesosphere on stage, we announced our Azure Container Service, which is Microsoft's containers as a service offering using Mesos, with partnership with Mesosphere and Docker to support Swarm, as well as Marathon and Kronos on top of Mesos. So that was a big step in us enabling customers. Many customers that are using microservices are using those technologies. So why did we do these things? Well, one of them is that we want to make sure, like I said, that customers coming to the platform can use the technologies and tools that they want to use with our technologies. We also want to enable these ecosystems to play on our platforms and bring and enhance our platforms by bringing those ecosystems into our platform. And then we hope that our technologies combined with these technologies will enhance your investments in those existing technologies. So HD Insight, for example, Hadoop as a service. Well, that should enhance your experience because you get managed Hadoop at that point. You can still leverage your Hadoop skills, your Hadoop applications, but we'll take care of running the Hadoop infrastructure for you. And by the way, that was a partnership with Hortonworks that's ongoing. And then it is really just a practical business decision. It's obvious that if we don't support Linux in our cloud platform, that we will be a Windows-only cloud, and that will mean that we're not really a viable cloud. And so it's just a practical business decision to enable these kinds of technologies for use with our technologies. Now let's talk about integrating now. So what does integrating mean, integrating open source? Well, this is us taking open source technologies and building on top of it. And there's a fantastic example that's just about a few months old with a new announcement that we made just a few weeks ago. It's our Microsoft Azure Data Lake technologies or services, which consists of 2 services, one we announced in the spring and one we just announced. Our Azure Data Lake Store, which we announced in the spring. This is a massive scale storage system designed for big data analytics. And what we decided to do, instead of create a proprietary interface or a new interface on top of this, we decided that the big data ecosystem really has standardized around HDFS as that interface. And so we went out the door with HDFS as the front end for this data lake service, Web HDFS. Now, what Data Lake allows you to do is create petabyte-sized files with exabyte-sized stores designed specifically for big data. And then, just a few weeks ago, like I said, at AzureCon, we announced our Azure Data Lake Analytics service to complement this. And this is where you can come and bring analytical compute jobs to run over that data. And what we decided to do there was to build that on top of Yarn. So internally, that's Yarn. Now, what it exposes is a new interface that we've created for big data analytics that is built on top of things that we've learned internally from. And that is a new offering called USQL, which combines the power of .NET and C# as well as SQL-type semantics over unstructured data. So it's kind of a combination of multiple worlds and really tries to leverage the ecosystem around C# as well. But this is also combined with our HD Insight service. So we've got Hadoop, USQL, Spark, and Storm all supported on top of this HDFS layer underneath it. But an example of us, instead of inventing our own stuff to create this infrastructure, we decided to take a bet on Yarn. Instead of us inventing our own interface as the data lake interface, we decided to take a bet on HDFS. And there's other examples like this across the platform and across Microsoft offerings. Another one is the Redis cache service. So when Azure started and we introduced a cache service, so you could stand up a cache between your web and data tier, we introduced our own caching technology, something we developed in-house. And what it turned out was that many customers were coming and saying, we're standardizing on Redis. And so we decided to, instead of creating something that looked like Redis, actually just take a bet on Redis. And so we work with Redis, and now our caching as a service is Redis Cache. And you can see some other examples there, Office 365, integration with Moodle, And we've also adopted open standards across our products, including Office and our Edge. And then there's a ton of internal projects that we don't talk about that just are bootstrapping internally things, where we now have the freedom and liberty to go out and say, let's go start with something that's open source. Now, the reasons that we do these kinds of things while we integrate open source, well, one is consistency with our other offerings. So you can see in the case of HDFS, well, what that does is just makes that Azure Data Lake service consistent with the other offerings we've got around big data that are standardized on HDFS. We also collaborate with the broader community in many of these cases, and that's really something we find valuable. It's like when we're working with Redis, collaborating with them, and there's other examples of us taking advantage of technologies, and we start to engage with those communities, and you'll see that we interact with those communities in other different ways as well as a result. But fundamentally, one of the obvious reasons that we do this is just agility and time to market. Instead of going and having to create everything our own just because we've got some principle of no open source, we need to do it ourselves, we get a lot of benefit out of saying, hey, if there's something that's open source and that will get us to market faster and enable ecosystems and help customers, then let's go and approach it that way. And so that's been really liberating for us. Now, the next way that we interact with open source is releasing stuff to open source. So let me give you some examples here. And this is one of the biggest releases of technologies into open source that we've got, something that was really considered secret sauce by Microsoft for a long, long time. And this is the .NET platform. So if you take a look at the .NET platform, and specifically the .NET Core aspect, you can see that the .NET platform consists of multiple layers. You see this common layer underneath, and then you see .NET Core on the right, and you see the .NET Framework on the left. And on top of that, you see ASP.NET 5, which is the web interface for building web apps on top of the .NET Frameworks and Core.NET. Now, these technologies, what we decided to do was take them cross-platform. So they've traditionally been only Windows, and if you wanted to leverage .NET technologies and C# on other platforms, you had to go to third parties, like use Mono, which is supported by Xamarin. What we decided to do is make these first-class support right from the core technologies, and so we've ported these things to Linux and OS X, and now they're available in their native form on those technologies. We've also done a lot of work to integrate Visual Studio support for debugging and deploying to Docker into Linux. So one of the demos that I did at DockerCon, for example, was deploying an ASP.NET 5 app into a Docker container running on Linux. And so that is an example of you being able to use Microsoft technologies on traditionally non-Microsoft platforms. But we've open sourced all of this stack from the bottom to the top. ASP.NET 5 or the ASP.NET libraries were open sourced a while back. Some of the .NET libraries were open sourced a while back, but you can see that we've open sourced the core CLR, what we considered secret sauce of the .NET platform. We've open sourced that, as well as the .NET Core there in the middle. All of that is open source. And there's many, many other examples of us open sourcing our own technologies. TypeScript, if you're familiar with TypeScript, which is type-safe JavaScript, that is technology produced by Microsoft, helps JavaScript developers create code that is more manageable and easy to debug. We're using TypeScript for all our TypeScript projects internally. Office 365 uses TypeScript heavily, and we've contributed all of that to open source. Python tools for Visual Studio. So many, many developers out there are using Python. In fact, the Python tools for Visual Studio add-in is the #1 add-in for Visual Studio. It's actually surpassed some of the C# technologies and .NET technologies that developers use for Visual Studio. Our Power BI, which is a visualization library for our big data analytics, that has been open sourced. You can see Autorest and Azure, all our SDKs for all of Azure. Our principle is SDKs, we open source them, so they're all up in GitHub. Linux integration services for Linux, for Hyper-V, they're all open sourced. We've got templates that allow you to create applications in Azure. All of that we do as open source. And then Microsoft Research has a tradition of releasing projects, their projects that they work on, into open source. So why are we releasing all this stuff into open source? So one of them is that we hope to build communities around these technologies by making them open and getting contributions and getting people excited about these technologies and being able to touch and feel them and contribute to them. Another one is that for the SDKs specifically, if they're open source, then developers when they run into problems, can more easily debug their problems just by going in and looking at the source and understanding exactly how it works. We can never have documentation that's as good as the source code itself for many developers. And so that's one of the values of having those SDKs being open sourced, or having bugs in the SDKs be fixed through contributions by people from the outside. We also are supporting an ecosystem internally. So if you take a look at one of the things that we've done by porting .NET to Linux, for example, is that internally at Microsoft, we've got more and more projects that are based on Linux. And we didn't want to be in a position where we'd force our own developers that are proficient in C# and .NET technologies to have to switch to something else if they wanted to develop for Linux. And so by making that cross-platform and open sourcing it as necessary, we get this ecosystem internally of support for .NET on Linux, and that means that we can have common tooling and consistent experiences and leverage those tools and techniques ourselves internally across those platforms. And then finally, let me talk a little bit about contribution to open source. So we have now, for the past few years, had a very aggressive culture of encouraging developers to contribute to open source projects. This is a list of some of the open source projects that we contribute to, that many Microsoft developers contribute to. If you take a look at the Linux kernel, Microsoft's traditionally been one of the top contributors to the Linux kernel. Of course, in the context of those Hyper-V integration services and support for Hyper-V. But another one is Docker. We've had a really great collaboration with Docker that goes back about a year and a half. I mentioned that I gave a keynote at DockerCon showing Visual Studio integration with Docker and deploying Docker containers to Linux. But one of the cool things that we've done with Docker is that we decided to build container technology into Windows Server, similar to the container technology in Linux. And instead of creating our own APIs for that, which might have been expected of the old Microsoft, we decided, hey, there's an ecosystem and a standard, basically, for Docker API, for container APIs. And that's really being managed and shepherded by Docker. So we work with Docker to make sure that you can leverage the Docker toolchain and APIs to manage Windows containers through collaboration with them. And as part of that, we actually, one of our developers that works on the Windows Server team, working on Docker technologies, is the #1 committer to the Docker GitHub repo from January to August, and might still be, I haven't checked recently, from January to August, the #1 contributor to the Docker GitHub repo, both in check-ins and commits. Take a look at Hadoop and Yarn. So that bet on Yarn that I talked about earlier with HD Insight and Azure Data Lake, that's not just a one-way interaction. We've made a ton of contributions to Yarn to make it better, to add resource constraints and scheduling and load balancing and better support for fine-grained optimizations. All of that has gone directly back into the Yarn open source community. The Python Software Foundation, here's an example of where we not just contribute code, but we contribute money. So we had a conference on campus, PyCon, which is scientific programming on Python. We funded that conference. It was the largest of its kind ever. And we also contribute money to these organizations like the Linux Foundation, which I mentioned. So it's not just people contributing, but Microsoft actually putting our money behind these things to help them. Redis Cache, I mentioned that one. OpenSSH, here's another example. We wanted to make sure that OpenSSH works great on Windows. So many people that are coming from a Linux world, they're using OpenSSH. And OpenSSH is a fantastic technology for headless management. So instead of forcing everybody to learn PowerShell remoting, which is the Microsoft first-party remoting, we said, let's let them bring their OpenSSH skills. And instead of us building our own OpenSSH library and tooling for Windows, let's go contribute to the open one. And so that's what we've done. And just yesterday, we announced that the work we've been doing on that is now up in GitHub in the open, so you can go contribute it and play with it and look at it as well. And we hope to have that production ready in the next few months. Mesos, I mentioned our collaboration with Mesosphere, another great, fantastic partnership. We've been working with Mesos on porting Mesos to Windows and making Mesos support Windows containers as well. All of that done in the open with Mesos and Mesosphere. And there's much, much more. So why do we do these things? Why are we contributing? Well, for one, there's an obvious one. We want to make sure that these technologies, you get a first-class experience on top of Azure and on top of Microsoft platforms like Hyper-V. So it's, of course, in our best interest to go and contribute code that's going to make that great with Microsoft technologies. But another one is that we do want to extend the community and the addressable reach of these communities. That OpenSSH example, we want to make sure that those communities that are using OpenSSH don't have an unpleasant experience or just don't opt out because they can't do things the way that they're used to doing or wanting to do it when it comes to interacting with Microsoft technologies. And we also want to establish credibility. This is a case where we know in the open source world, you can't just take. You need to give and take. It's about a community, and that's why we're all here. And so we recognize that if we just took these technologies, built our stuff on it, and didn't give it back, that we wouldn't be really participating in the community, and the community wouldn't participate with us. And so it is a very strong principle of ours to participate in this in the way that the open source community expects, which means let's all work together on this out in the open. And then we want to enhance our joint customer experiences. So this isn't just a one-way street. It's not just that, hey, Mesos support for Windows is enabling Microsoft. It also helps Mesos. Docker on Windows helps Docker and their customers as well. One of the things that Docker has told us, for example, is that many of their customers have been asking, when are you going to have support for Windows? And that's because many of them are mixed shops. There's still a lot of Windows out there and lots of Linux and Windows mixed shops, and so they want to use the same tooling for both. And so Docker, working with Microsoft, helps both of our customers jointly, and doing it out in the open, of course, is a great way to collaborate on that. We also participate in open standards bodies, and this is another place where we contribute and support open source efforts. I've just got a few of them listed up here. So the Linux Foundation, it's kind of hard to read there. It's at the middle and the bottom. The Core Infrastructure Foundation, the Open Container Initiative, and Open Compute Project. And so those of you not familiar with some of these, the Open Infrastructure Foundation, that is our work with a number of other companies to fund development that will help the security of open source products. So one of them is OpenSSL, where we've got funding to support code reviews of OpenSSL to make sure that it's secure for everybody, and Microsoft's participating in that. The Open Compute Project, that's an example of us contributing to open standards. Of course, Open Compute Project, we're partners in there with Facebook and other companies, of contributing our cloud platform server designs. So this is something where contributing those designs can help enterprises build their own servers to take advantage of the learnings that we've got in our hyperscale cloud. But there's also other reasons that we participate in that. One is that by making these open standards, now we can get the OEM ecosystem out there to see these server designs and build them, which will bring down costs for anybody wanting to take advantage of these kinds of designs. And the Open Container Initiative, again, this is strong work with Docker and other companies to say, let's try to avoid bifurcation of containers and the container APIs. Let's standardize on this, and let's work all together as a community to drive the technologies forward so that everybody can take advantage of it. So finally, the why of Microsoft really is about giving customers choice with our technologies, not forcing them to have to take a Microsoft stack from bottom to top, but be able to use the technologies they bring from the open community and other places on Microsoft technologies, and to take advantage of our technologies where you want to. Really a mix and match. You get to decide. It's, of course, agility and time to market, as you saw some examples. Just makes business sense for us to be open-minded about taking advantage of open source technologies where we can get time to market. And then building a strong ecosystem and building a sense of community around our technologies and open source technologies where Microsoft's a participant at the table just like everybody else. So I encourage you guys to connect with open source at Microsoft. There's many open source specific job openings at Microsoft. You can see there's 498 jobs listed. I just did this query a couple days ago. 498 jobs that we've got open with the word Linux in it. We are hungry for people that are experts in open source technologies, including Linux. You can see there's 330 jobs that are outside the United States. And there's many more inside the United States. So even if you're from outside, there's a job for you at Microsoft. And then you can see there's a ton of GitHub repos. This is one of the things that we've standardized on is all our open work is done in GitHub. So you can go there and you can find Azure, Office, Visual Studio, and Microsoft as a whole, over 240 repositories up there in GitHub. So I'd like to encourage all of you to pass your resumes to the center aisle, and I can just pick them up on my way out here. But I just want to conclude by saying that Microsoft loves open source. It's fantastic to be at a conference like this, be invited up here to participate in the community with you guys, and we hope to make this, I have to say, we've been working at this for a while. We're still learning, and I think that with your help, we'll learn and be great communities, great members of this community. Thanks very much.